Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
The news this past week has been dominated by three stories that upon first glance may appear to be unrelated, but that actually are very tied together. In the religious world, John MacArthur passed away on Monday, July 14th, after being the pastor of Grace Community Church in Sun Valley, California for 55 years, leading Grace to You, the Master's Seminary, and being a best-selling author many times over. As B&G Executive Director Mark Wingfield wrote in 2023, quote, "There is no single pastor who has been more influential on young theological conservatives in the last 50 years than MacArthur. Not Billy Graham, not Adrian Rogers, not Charles Stanley, not John Piper. MacArthur has been the gold standard for conservative and reformed theology not only through his preaching, but through his books, his commentaries, his study Bible, his podcasts, his videos, his conferences, his public appearances." When I first learned in December that he may pass away soon, I reflected on how his life should be written about after he dies. While he was a hero to conservative evangelicals, his wielding of the gospel as a weapon of authority sacralized the abuse of white evangelicalism's least of these. So I knew that when he died, conservatives would be singing his praises, while an untold number of people would be sitting in silence, knowing how deeply he justified and covered up abuse. For the least of these, MacArthur was no hero. He was a villain. A man who cast himself as the emperor who cannot be questioned. So I decided to write a piece last December to have available for whenever he passed that would essentially ask the question, how do we respond when villains die? Matthew 7, 1-2 says, "Do not judge so that you may not be judged, for the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get." So I figured, rather than judge MacArthur's life based on my standards, why not respond based on his own standards? And one thing that MacArthur is known for is for calling out those who conservative evangelicals believe to be false teachers or false prophets. So for my review of MacArthur's life, I laid out how MacArthur defined false prophets, and then I considered his teaching in light of his own definition of false prophets. The result was the story that was published on July 14th, 2025 at Baptist News Global titled, "John MacArthur Met His Own Definition of a False Prophet." And the response has been quite ferocious. William Wolfe said, "Absolutely vile article from Baptist News here. At Rick Pidcock, at Mark Wing Dallas, and everyone involved should be ashamed of themselves." Justin Peters said, quote, "I've often said that there are some people I'm actually relieved do not like me. John's family, the members of GCC, and the millions of people who are profoundly grateful for his ministry should be relieved that the likes of Baptist News Global does not like him." And apologist James White of Alpha and Omega Ministries had this to say on his live show, The Dividing Line.
Obviously, some of the written stuff that I've seen, there's some guy with, what is it, Baptist Global News? Is that what it is? I saw it this morning. I didn't bother looking at it. And when I looked at the picture of the author, this vile man, I went, I've seen this guy somewhere before. I have to wonder if he hadn't taken a shot at me sometime in the past or something. I'm not 100% certain. I just didn't even want to invest the time in it. But obviously, stuff like that was probably already written, just waiting to be posted. And it's pretty amazing.
If anyone associated with White is listening, I'll refresh his memory. I didn't actually go after him before. Instead, I wrote an article about Vadi Bakkum's promotion of violence against children and the subjugation of women through his stay-at-home daughters movement, and then White got really upset about what I wrote and went after me. Of course, these responses were quite tame compared to the hundreds of comments online that made fun of how they imagine I use the restroom, made fun of my name, my being a stay-at-home dad, and that called me gay slurs for having pronouns in my bio. So, B&G Executive Director Mark Wingfield followed up with a piece titled, "When is the right time to speak the truth about toxic people?" Wingfield said, quote, "Upon the death of John MacArthur yesterday, B&G published two articles, one a traditional obituary, and one an analysis piece that used MacArthur's own definition of a false prophet to assess his ministry. That second piece has stirred a hornet's nest, particularly with MacArthur's vast fan base, but also with some friends of BNG who think we went too far in speaking ill of the dead. Let me reiterate. John MacArthur did more harm to the cause of Christ than Paul Pressler, and that's saying a hell of a lot. Pressler took control of one denomination. MacArthur influenced pastors and lay leaders across evangelical Christianity and taught them to be mean-spirited, divisive, judgmental, and absolutely certain he alone held God's truth. That is the definition of a cult leader, not a pastor. MacArthur's theology was and remains toxic. It was and remains abusive. It was and remains cruel. It was and remains untrue to the Spirit of Jesus Christ. Not to say so, especially at his death, is to be complicit with allowing that theology to go unchecked. Then on Wednesday, I added on Facebook, because John MacArthur said the universe is a hierarchy of authority and submission to all men, with evangelical pastors at the top, there is no both sides of this conversation. He was the emperor. All women, children, and, quote, lesser men were under him. When the emperor dies, it's fundamentally different than when a survivor dies. It's completely appropriate for those in exile to process it in public. The church leaders who covered sexual abuse making points about a survivor and advocate who dies are fundamentally different than advocates and survivors talking about their imperial abusers dying. Don't blame those of us who are talking about MacArthur. Blame him for setting up these hierarchies to begin with. He created this situation. He made himself the highest power. So now his reputation can be reflected on by those he harmed, and we don't need your permission to tell us when and how we're allowed to talk. But MacArthur isn't the only story this week. We're also following the latest on Alligator Alcatraz and on the Epstein files. I covered Alligator Alcatraz in detail in episode 36 and the Epstein files in episode 39, so today I'd like to follow up on these stories by sharing the latest news. But I'd like to begin by setting the context for both of those with the story about MacArthur. Specifically, I want us to consider whether or not MacArthur and his millions of followers are creating the dynamics that lead to the cruelty and cover-ups we're seeing in Alligator Alcatraz and the Epstein story, or if they're offering some kind of good news, some kind of alternative transformed vision shaped by a different kind of gospel. And the reason I want to pair these stories together is that I want to demonstrate how theology can either sacralize or subvert the way of power over and violence toward your neighbors. So first, let's set the stage by hearing from MacArthur himself.
The roles of men and women have become a battleground today, and I think all of us are aware of this. We are constantly hearing about the battle for women's rights. And I'm sure if it goes far enough, we'll have a men's lib to try to gain back some of the ground that's been lost. Just because society tends to always want to equalize itself. I think Satan is feverishly involved in upsetting the divine order any way he possibly can. And it's clear as you study the Bible that God has a divine order in society related to man and woman. And of course that is manifest in marriage, it's manifest in the church, and it's manifest in every dimension of human life. And God's basic pattern is there are two factors in society, authority and submission. And God has designed that men be given the position of authority and women the position of submission. It is generally then true that a man, whether he be married or single, must think of himself as someone who has been given by God a responsibility for authority in one sense or another. And a woman, whether she is married or single, must recognize the fact that in general, as a woman, she must have a spirit of submission to all men. Now, we don't want to carry that too far. We're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. But the idea is that the spirit of a woman is the recognition that she is in the position of subjection to men whom God has given authority in the world. The principle is this, people get it. Authority and submission pervade the whole universe. In the relationship between man and man, there is authority and submission. In the relationship between man and God, there is authority and submission. In the relationship between God and God, there is authority and submission. The entire universe is pervaded by this concept. And what is new here is not that the wife is to be subject to her husband. That isn't new because the Old Testament taught that. What is new is the vastness, the scope of this principle. That it absolutely pervades everything. Now listen, it's simple. Think of it this way. If Christ does not submit to the Father, then redemption is not accomplished. Man is lost, he is doomed, and God is at war with himself if the Son does not submit. If man, on the other hand, does not submit to Christ, then man is lost. His destiny is denied, and judgment falls on him. If woman does not submit to man in the family is shattered and society is wrecked.
So this is essentially the biggest question we have today, is what is the nature of the universe? What is going on here? Is there some kind of a story? Is there some kind of meaning to the relationships and the way things are structured in the universe? And for MacArthur, he subscribes to an ancient idea of a hierarchical universe, one that is really rooted in ancient Roman Empire hierarchies or ancient Near Eastern hierarchies, where reality is a hierarchy from the heavens down to the earth, where the activities of the gods are mirrored in the activities of humans, and everyone is structured in their place in these static positions of authority and submission. And he thinks that absolutely pervades everything within the Trinity and within human relationships, as men are over women, parents are over children, masters are over slaves. So the question then, within this paradigm, is what happens to those who won't submit?
God is holy and mankind is not. In fact, the Bible explicitly teaches that every person who has ever lived has broken God's holy law. Every person who has ever lived has rebelled against God, has incurred, therefore, his just wrath, and has been duly sentenced to eternal punishment. That is the universal bad news. Because he is holy and just, he demands punishment for sin. And every sin must be and will be punished. Every sin ever committed by every person. Calvary is more about the wrath of God than it is about anything else. God brought hell to Jerusalem that day. God showed up in wrath. And the interesting thing is, it wasn't wrath on the Romans. And it wasn't wrath on the Jewish leaders. And it wasn't wrath on the people. It was wrath on the Son. God unleashed the full extent of his fury on Jesus Christ in wrath with fierce anger. And God, who is the punisher of all the souls in eternal hell, shows up in the darkness of Calvary to punish his Son. And he gives his Son eternal hell.
So in empire hierarchies, those who won't submit are punished. That is justice. You don't submit, you get punished. And the punishment is violence against your body. It's exile. This is the way empires have traditionally handled things, and it's the theology of MacArthur. This is what he thinks God does. If you will not submit to this specific evangelical way of doing things, then God is going to violently punish you for eternity. Or God is going to violently punish Jesus on the cross. Either way, the justice is in the violent punishment of a human body. And what is this all ultimately about? It's ultimately about the glory of that authority, which is really a story about power. Here's MacArthur defining what he believes is the nature of an evangelical pastor.
The primary effort in feminism is not equality. They don't want equality. That's why 99% of plumbers are men. They don't want equal power to be a plumber. They want to be senators, preachers, congressmen, president, the power structure in a university. They want power, not equality. And this is the highest location, they can ascend to that power in the evangelical church and overturn what is clearly scriptural.
So MacArthur doesn't define a pastor as somebody who helps people process their wounds, as somebody who fosters the fruit of the Spirit in people. For MacArthur, the pastorate is an ascension to power. These aren't my words. These aren't me caricaturing him in this way. This is how he defined the pastorate. When talking about Beth Moore, he says that women who want to be pastors, they want this power. They want to ascend to the highest location one can ascend to, that power in the evangelical church. That is how he honestly views the pastorate. It's about the glory of the authority. And so, in that world, there are things to protect. There is territory to protect. There are positions to protect. And that's where cover-ups come in. So what happens when accusations are brought against those in authority?
It ought to be ignored. To put it simply, one of the best ways you can protect your pastors and elders is with a deaf ear to accusation. It's that simple. When a man is placed into spiritual leadership, he has to anticipate that hateful, jealous, sinful people will falsely accuse him to try to ruin his ministry, and people can and often will say anything and everything. This is standard behavior with reference to spiritual leaders. It is standard approach of the enemy to discredit. You see, men's ministries can be brought to a halt due to no fault of their own, but due to the fault of people who will listen to a false accusation. And so that discrediting of that man comes totally unrelated to reality in his own life. The word accusation, by the way, kategoria, sounds like category. It comes from two words, agora, which means, it's the word for agora down the road here, the town. It means a meeting place, a public place, a marketplace. Then kata is against. So it is to say something against a person in a public meeting place. That is to bring a formal accusation. And when someone comes to bring a formal public accusation against an elder or a pastor, we are not to listen to that. We are not to entertain that. We are not to investigate that.
For MacArthur, the nature of the universe is a hierarchy of authority and submission. So therefore, justice is the cruel, violent punishment of the bodies of those who won't submit. The entire narrative and value is about sovereignty over territory, which is power. So the fruit of this theology is that this universe becomes about protecting power and covering up any accusations that might threaten that power. So let's consider these dynamics: authority and submission, punishment, power, and cover-ups in the Alligator Alcatraz story. As the script goes on the right, we are the United States of America, a Christian nation with a constitution that was basically inspired by God and based on the book of Deuteronomy. As such, we are essentially God's chosen people, given a land in which, inspired by the ancient Israelites, we drove out the native inhabitants through genocide and established our sovereignty over the land. We are the authority, and we set the laws, specifically immigration laws. If you want to be a part of our nation, then you must bend the knee to our authority. And if you don't, jump through all of these hoops as violent gangs and governments are on your heels threatening your family, then you have failed to submit and must now be punished by being chased down and smashed into the pavement by masked men in military garb, in many cases, and then sent to sit in a cage in the middle of a swamp surrounded by alligators, pythons, and mosquitoes. In fact, here is the audio of a reel that the Department of Homeland Security recently posted.
There's a Bible verse I think about sometimes, many times. It goes, "And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us?"
Can roll on for a long time, roll on for a long time. Sooner or later, gotta cut you down. Sooner or later, gotta cut you down.
And I said, "Here am I. Send me."
Suddenly, a U.S. Customs Border and Protection badge fills the screen as the music immediately intensifies and images continue of helicopters flying overhead and heavily armed Border Patrol agents scanning the ground, boating toward the brush, wearing night vision goggles, using lasers, and looking at vehicles and people through scopes. Sooner or later, God'll cut you down, the song says. So when Florida Democrats visited Alligator Alcatraz this past week, here's what they found.
The pictures that you've seen don't do it justice. They are essentially packed into cages, wall-to-wall humans, 32 detainees per cage. The only thing inside those cages are their bunk beds, and there are 3 tiny toilets that are toilet units that have a sink attached to it. So they essentially drink, they get their drinking water and they brush their teeth where they poop in the same unit. They bragged that they went above standards, supposedly, and gave them a 3-foot privacy wall that stretches the length inside the 32 detainee cage. A 3-foot privacy wall that stretches the length of the 3 toilets in a row. The showers provide no privacy at all. There are no curtains on it. It's a big open shower unit. There are, small walls in each shower. But, we're talking about all 900 men who are held in this facility. It is built currently for 1,000, and they have no privacy at all when they're showering. For meals, when we walked through the quote-unquote meal prep area, the kitchen area, for lack of a better term, they had the portions that were available for detainees, and they had the portions that were available for employees being prepared at the same time. The portions available for employees, large pieces of roast chicken, large sausages, and the detainees' lunches were a small, gray turkey and cheese sandwich, an apple, and chips, and that's it. We're talking about fully grown men being fed very small portions.
And so one can't help but understand and conclude that this is a total cruel political stunt meant to have a spectacle of political theater, and it's wasting taxpayer dollars and putting our ICE agents, our troops, and ICE detainees in jeopardy.
We asked them about a hurricane plan. Of course, the plan is to get people out, and they know that the first, and it doesn't even have to be a hurricane, the first real storm that comes by here, all that money that's been used to build this will completely go to waste. So this has nothing to do with what they tell you it is, and it's all a cruel stunt. Cruelty isn't just the point, it's the strategy in this.
The justice of authority and submission hierarchies is the cruel, violent punishment of the bodies of those who won't submit. This is the theology of MacArthur and conservative white evangelicals. Sooner or later, God is going to cut your body down. And it's the politics of Trump and Christian nationalism. It actually doesn't make anything right. It doesn't heal anything. It doesn't foster wholeness of any kind. Instead, it causes wounds and exile. And that leads to our third story, which is the Epstein files. I won't rehash everything we covered in our last episode, other than to remind everyone that Trump used his position of authority to see and take women's bodies against their consent. Because Trump's pageant employees told the girls to walk up to him despite their lack of clothing and to fawn all over him, the girls, and probably some of Trump's employees, were fearful of punishment if they didn't submit. Why? Because Trump is a powerful, self-glory obsessed man. In fact, he's never been as powerful as he is now, and thanks to the Supreme Court and to the utter timidity of congressional Republicans, no U.S. president has ever had this much power. But rather than using his power to release the Epstein files, he's instead attacking the media for asking him about it, and now, since our last episode, he's even attacking his own supporters.
Instead, they want to talk about the Epstein hoax. And the sad part is it's people that are really doing the Democrats' work. They're stupid people.
Trump now has the power to protect or release any evidence about the Epstein case. And many people are wondering, given his past history of sexual abuse and his connections with Epstein, if maybe the reason he's not allowing anything to be released is that he's on the list. And now Republicans are having to figure out how to respond. So here's a montage of what they've been saying over the past few days.
Some have speculated that the Biden DOJ may have left the Epstein files in such a manner that it leads directly with an arrow toward Donald Trump, just as a middle finger toward Trump. Not that he did anything whatsoever, just that they're bastards and they knew he was coming in and they knew his people were interested in this story.
Even though there are unanswered questions about Epstein, it is in fact time to move on.
At some point, you have to really trust that Donald Trump does care about what we care about.
Trust the president. I mean, my God, this is the man that God saved his life 1 year ago from a bullet. Don't you think God appointed him? Then leave him alone. You trust him, right? Oh, not anymore? Because he won't go down your favorite rabbit hole? Are we that shallow, America? You trust Pam Bondi. You trust Dan Bongino. You trust Kash Patel. Let it go. Get over it. Move on. Que sera, sera.
This is brilliant. Everyone's so mad, as they should be, that he said that. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, this is brilliant. Where has this anger been for the past decade? I have been so pissed, so frustrated, screaming at the top of my lungs, touring the country, giving speeches exposing Jeffrey Epstein. I have been so pissed and angry and riled up about this for years. And now I'm starting to see everyone else bring up that kind of energy. And now I'm thinking, that was brilliant. That was brilliant. He is getting his base so fired up to demand justice. We're probably now going to see the mainstream media go crazy and say, oh, President Trump acts like Jeffrey Epstein isn't a big deal. He doesn't care. How horrible is this? Well, what a brilliant way, Hannah, to get the mainstream media to cover Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, I kind of feel like we're seeing a little classic President Trump kabuki theater 5D chess here.
The only thing that's coming today is the crucifixion of Donald Trump. Oh no, not by the Romans. Yeshua, Jesus Christ, was not killed by the Romans. Oh yes, they drove the nails, but it was the Jews that delivered him to them. And one can't help but wonder if history is not repeating itself and we are not delivering Donald Trump to the crucifixion of his enemies.
Remember what MacArthur said about accusations against church authorities. He said, quote, "When someone comes to bring a formal public accusation against an elder or a pastor, we are not to listen to that. We are not to entertain that. We are not to investigate that." This is how power gets protected. It's how cover-ups of abuse happen. And it's how women, children, racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQ people, and anyone on the straight white conservative Christians' least of these list are harmed. And make no mistake, ultimately none of this is about being biblical. It's about power. And if you doubt me, remember what MacArthur said about the pastorate being the highest location one can ascend to, that power in the evangelical church. And what did he say during his rant about ascending to power? What was the context? He was in the middle of mocking the conservative evangelical author and speaker Beth Moore, telling her to go home.
Go home.
And that is what this is really about. It's about keeping women from power by boxing them in the home. Here's Pastor Joel Webbin laying it all out.
When you say, well, I don't think that, it's like, well, I disagree with Pam Bondi because I think she's hiding the Epstein files. And I'd be like, yeah, but also I don't like Pam Bondi because she's a woman. And she shouldn't be in public, not in politics. You know, like the meme is like, you and I are not the same. You don't like it for this reason. I don't like, it's like, oh, I don't like Pam Bondi because of her positions. I'm like, I don't like Pam Bondi because she needs to be at home.
This is why MacArthur's followers have come after me in response to this article for being a stay-at-home dad. They're seeing things like, Pidcock has never written anything of importance. He has never accomplished anything that will last, and he's an absolute failure to his wife and children. To the Theobros, having a penis gives you the right to be over women with an authority that absolutely pervades everything. And if you don't exercise your authority over women, then you've absolutely failed them. Or this one. Rick abuses his own wife by making her work so he can stay safe in the protection of his own home. Judas Iscariot would be proud of non-men like you. So, being okay with your wife having a career makes you a non-man? Interesting. Or this one. Pidcock has contributed nothing to society. He can't even contribute to the support of his own family. He is worse than wicked. He is worthless. So of course he finds a great man of God to be offensive. In case it's not clear for the men out there, being a stay-at-home parent is supporting your family. To these guys, that's okay if a woman does it. In fact, it's the only thing women are allowed to do. But if a man is the primary giver for the kids during the day, then he's contributing nothing and is worthless. All of these attacks that have been personal attacks to me, they're really revealing the way these men think about women. That is the most honest truth about all of this. The way they criticize me as a stay-at-home dad for critiquing MacArthur in my writing is the way they treat women. They treat women as contributing nothing, and as basically worthless if they're not in the kitchen, the laundry room, the bathroom, or the bedroom. Theology has consequences, and when we consider the dynamics of authority and submission, punishment, power, and cover-ups at Alligator, Alcatraz, and in the Epstein cover-ups, they're the exact same dynamics we see at play in MacArthur's theology. So if we want to continue the ethics of power over and violence toward our neighbors, and then protecting the powerful through cover-ups, then MacArthur's theology can sacralize it for us. But if we want to actually have some good news that has a chance at liberating the oppressed and caring for the least of these, then we have some theological towers to deconstruct. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.